Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the incredible story of how 13 colonies, who felt more like cogs in a machine than partners in an empire, decided to break away and build their own nation from scratch. Okay, to really get this, let's just put ourselves in their shoes for a second. Imagine that the biggest decisions about your life, how much you're taxed, who you can sell your products to, what laws you have to follow, are all being made across an entire ocean by people you will never ever meet. You don't get a vote, you have no real voice. That was the reality for the American colonists, and it's really the heart of this entire story. So that brings us to our first section. We're going to break down the system of British control that was in place for over a century. A system that little by little started to feel less like protection and more like a cage. For more than 100 years, this was the basic setup. You had the 13 colonies, right? And while they had their own local governments, the real power was back in Britain with King George III. He sent over these royal governors whose job was to enforce his laws. And get this, if a local assembly ever did something the governor didn't like, he could just dissolve it. Poof, gone. It made it crystal clear that colonial opinions were, optional.
And the engine driving this whole thing was an economic policy called mercantilism. The easiest way to think about it is like a super one-sided business deal. The colonies were there for one reason, and one reason only, to make Great Britain rich.
And here's the playbook for how it worked. The colonies had all these amazing raw materials, right? Tobacco, timber, you name it. They were forced to sell all of it exclusively to Britain, and usually at a low price. Then they had to turn around and buy back more expensive finished goods from British merchants. Want to trade with France or Spain? Nope, absolutely forbidden. This system kept the colonial economy on a tight leash, siphoning wealth straight back to Britain.
Well, this kind of economic pressure cooker was just bound to explode. Britain had just fought a massive, incredibly expensive war, the 7 Years' War, partly to protect these colonies. Now they were drowning in debt. So London looks across the Atlantic and sees the colonies as a piggy bank just waiting to be cracked open. And this, right here, is where things really start to get ugly.
First up, the sugar tax in 1764. And don't let the name fool you. It wasn't just on sugar. It was a tax on a bunch of imported goods, which meant it hit the wallet of pretty much every single person in the colonies.
Next, they rolled out the Stamp Act. All of a sudden, colonists had to pay for an official stamp on almost any piece of paper they used. We're talking legal documents, newspapers, they even taxed a deck of playing cards.
And then the tea tax. This one really hit home because it put a tax on one of the most common, most beloved items in every single colonial household. It made the reach of British taxation totally inescapable.
But here's the thing you have to understand. It wasn't just about the money. It was about this powerful idea that just spread like wildfire. No taxation without representation. See, the colonists had 0 elected officials in the British Parliament. No one was speaking for them. And they came to believe that any government that taxed its people without their say-so wasn't just unfair, it was tyrannical. And to make sure these unpopular taxes were collected, what did Britain do? They sent in the army. The Quartering Act actually forced colonists to open their private homes to British soldiers, to feed them, to give them a place to sleep. Imagine that. It felt like a total invasion of their homes and their liberty, and it created this constant, simmering resentment right in their own neighborhoods. With all this constant friction, this feeling of basically being occupied in their own towns, the whole place was a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And it wasn't long before angry protests boiled over into actual violence.
In 1770, that spark came. During a chaotic confrontation on a Boston street, British soldiers fired their muskets into a crowd of civilians. 5 unarmed Americans were killed. It immediately became known as the Boston Massacre, and it sent these shockwaves of horror and outrage across all the colonies. For many, this was proof that British rule had become a deadly threat. And you can see right here just how quickly things started to spiral out of control. After the shock of the massacre in 1770, things were tense but kind of quiet for a few years. But then, boom, 1773, Britain passes the Tea Act. Instead of calming things down, it directly provoked the Boston Tea Party later that same year, where colonists famously disguised themselves, boarded the ships, and dumped a fortune's worth of British tea into the harbor. It was a spectacular act of defiance.
How Britain reacted to the Boston Tea Party? Well, that would be the final push,
Their response was meant to crush the rebellion, but instead, it actually united the colonies and pushed them toward an idea that just a few years earlier would have seemed totally insane: complete and total independence.
So King George's response was a series of really harsh laws that the colonists nicknamed the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston's port, they stripped away local governments. They were designed to punish and make an example out of Massachusetts. But the plan completely backfired. Instead of scaring the other colonies into line, it made them think, hey, if they can do that to Boston, they can do that to us. It brought them together against a common enemy like never before.
By 1775, that was it. The breaking point was reached. Fighting erupted between colonial militias and British soldiers. We're talking about farmers and shopkeepers, ordinary people, picking up guns to fight the most powerful military on the planet. The American Revolutionary War had begun. A year later, colonial leaders made it official. They issued the Declaration of Independence. And this document wasn't just a breakup letter to the king. It was a revolutionary statement of political philosophy. It declared that all people are born with natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the entire purpose of a government is to protect those rights, not to take them away.
When you boil it all down, this whole story is so much more than just names and dates. It's a powerful, timeless lesson about what can happen when people are governed without their consent, and what happens when the desire for freedom becomes more powerful than the fear of an empire.
And that leaves us with this really provocative question. It's a question the American colonists answered for themselves, and it's a question that is still just as relevant today for people all over the world.